When we talk about avoidance, we have to start by clearing up one of the most damaging myths in modern relationships. The idea that avoidant people leave because they don't feel enough. In reality, many leave because they feel too much, too fast, and without the internal tools to regulate what closeness awakens in them. Avoidance is not the absence of emotion, it's the management of emotion through distance. And once you understand that, the entire dynamic looks different. From a psychological standpoint, avoidant attachment is not a character flaw. It's an adaptation. Somewhere early in life, the nervous system learned a very specific lesson, depending on others, is unsafe, overwhelming, or pointless. Maybe love came with conditions. Maybe vulnerability was met with rejection, intrusion, or emotional chaos. So the mind did what it always does to survive. It built a strategy. Stay self-sufficient. Stay in control. Don't need too much. Don't feel too deeply. And most importantly, don't stay when closeness threatens your sense of autonomy or safety. That strategy works until it doesn't. In adult relationships, this wiring creates a paradox. Avoidants are often drawn to connection. They fall in love. They feel excitement, desire, even deep affection. But intimacy activates the very alarm system designed to protect them. As emotional closeness increases, so does internal stress. Not because the partner is doing something wrong, but because closeness itself registers as a threat. Their body reads intimacy as loss of freedom, loss of self, or impending disappointment. So what do? They pull back. They intellectualize. They focus on flaws. They convince themselves they need space, clarity, time. And here's the key point. From the inside, this doesn't feel like abandonment. It feels like self-preservation. It feels logical. It feels necessary. And because it feels necessary, they rarely question it in the moment. This is where the real damage begins, not out of malice, but out of misunderstanding. The avoidant often believes they are being honest by withdrawing. They tell themselves, I'm just being true to myself, or I don't want to lead them on. But what they don't see yet is that silence, distance, and emotional unavailability communicate something very different to the person on the other side, to the partner especially, one who values emotional closeness. The withdrawal doesn't feel neutral. It feels personal. It feels like rejection, confusion, and instability. And because avoidants don't usually explain what's happening internally, the partner fills in the blanks with self-blame. Philosophically, this is where intention and impact diverge. The avoidance intention is safety, the impact is harm, and both can be true at the same time. What makes this dynamic so powerful is that avoidance is reinforced by short-term relief. The moment distance is created, the nervous system calms, anxiety drops, control is restored. The avoidant thinks, see, I needed this, but this relief is deceptive. It's not resolution, it's suppression. And suppressed emotion doesn't disappear, it waits. Over time, the pattern repeats, connection builds, discomfort rises, distance follows. Each cycle teaches the avoidant that intimacy is the problem, not the unhealed fear underneath it. And each cycle teaches the partner that love requires chasing, over-explaining, and shrinking their own needs. That's how two people can be deeply bonded and slowly destroyed without ever raising their voices. Now, it's important to say this clearly. Understanding avoidance does not excuse its consequences. Compassion is not the same as permission. You can recognize that someone's behavior is rooted in survival and still acknowledge that it caused real emotional damage. Avoidants don't destroy hearts because they are careless. They destroy hearts because they are disconnected from the cost of their coping mechanisms. And disconnection is the key word here. Avoidants are often disconnected not just from others, but from their own emotional experience. They may not consciously register grief, longing, or regret in the moment. Instead, they feel irritation, numbness, or a vague sense that something is off. This is why they can walk away from meaningful relationships appearing calm or resolved, while the other person is devastated. It's not that they are unaffected, it's that their emotional processing is delayed. Eventually, life creates the conditions where avoidance no longer works. The partner stops chasing. The relationship ends, the distractions fade, and without the immediate pressure of intimacy, the avoidance defenses relax. That's when the feelings they postpone begin to surface. Not all at once, but enough to be unsettling. This is the first crack in the strategy. The moment when the mind can no longer convincingly argue that distance equals safety. And that moment sets the stage for everything that follows in this story. Because once avoidance is understood as self-protection, rather than indifference, a much harder question emerges. What happens when the very thing that once kept you safe becomes the reason you lose what mattered most? That question doesn't arrive gently. It arrives through absence, through the realization that someone who once made room for your distance has finally chosen themselves, and that is where the breaking point begins. So here's the thought I want to leave you with. The strategies that protected you in the past may be the same ones costing you your future. And awareness begins the moment you're willing to ask whether distance is truly strength or simply fear in disguise. Once avoidance becomes the pattern, something subtle but devastating begins to unfold, not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, and almost invisibly. This is where the real cost shows up, not in the avoidance internal world yet, but in the emotional landscape of the person who stays. And that's why this phase is so dangerous. Because by the time the damage is obvious, it's already deep. For the partner, love starts out as trust. There's openness, curiosity, hope. They assume that if something feels off, it can be talked through. That's how healthy relationships work, right? But with avoidance, communication doesn't collapse in a single moment, it erodes. One conversation gets postponed, one emotional bid gets missed, one vulnerable moment is met with distance instead of reassurance, and the partner doesn't immediately think, this is harmful. They think they're stressed, or they just need space, or if I explain myself better, we'll reconnect. This is where the heart begins to fracture. Not from one clear rejection, but from 1,000 small disconnections. Psychologically, humans are wired to seek emotional consistency. When connection becomes unpredictable, warm one moment, distant the next, the nervous system doesn't relax. It stays alert. The partner starts scanning for signals. A delayed text feels heavy. A change in tone feels loaded. Silence becomes deafening. And without clear explanations, the mind does what it always does under uncertainty. It turns inward and searches for fault. Did I ask for too much? Was I too emotional? Am I not enough for them to stay present? These questions don't arise because the partner is weak. They arise because ambiguity is intolerable to the human psyche. And avoidance creates ambiguity by design. What makes this especially painful is that the avoidant often still offers just enough connection to keep hope alive. A moment of closeness, a kind gesture, a reminder that love exists, just not consistently. Philosophically, this creates a double bind. The partner is emotionally invested yet emotionally unsafe. They are attached yet never fully met. And over time, they begin to trade authenticity for proximity. They suppress their needs, soften their emotions, rehearse conversations before speaking, all in an effort to maintain connection. This is love turns into self-abandonment. The slow destruction of the heart isn't about dramatic betrayal. It's about the quiet loss of emotional certainty. Trust erodes not because the avoidant lies, but because their availability is unreliable. Safety dissolves not because of conflict, but because conflict is avoided altogether. The partner never knows where they stand, and that instability changes them. You can see it in how they speak, less direct, more careful. You can hear it in their questions, seeking reassurance instead of connection. You can feel it in their energy, tense, watchful, trying not to trigger distance. Over time, their nervous system adapts to the inconsistency. They become hyper-aware, emotionally exhausted, and yet still attached. That's the paradox of this dynamic. The more love is withheld, the harder they try to earn it. And here's the part that's hardest to hear but necessary to understand. The avoidant often doesn't witness this destruction as it's happening. They see a partner who is too sensitive, overthinking, or asking for too much. From their perspective, the relationship feels demanding, heavy, even suffocating. What they don't see is that the partner's anxiety is a response to emotional deprivation, not an inherent trait. The behavior they find overwhelming is often the consequence of the distance they created. This is not about blame. It's about causality. Emotionally, the partner's heart begins to fracture in stages. First comes confusion, trying to understand what changed. Then comes self-doubt, assuming responsibility for the distance. Then comes grief, mourning, a version of the relationship that no longer exists. And finally, if the pattern continues long enough, comes emotional numbness or resignation. They stop asking, stop reaching, stop believing they can be fully loved here. And that moment, when the partner begins to emote, ionic withdrawal, is often misread by the avoidant as relief. The tension drops, the requests stop, the emotional intensity fades, the avoidant thinks finally things are better. But what's actually happening is far more serious. The partner isn't calmer because the relationship is healthier. They're calmer because they're detaching. They're protecting themselves from further loss. This is where the destruction becomes irreversible. Because once a person disconnects from their hope, once they stop believing that emotional closeness is possible, something inside them closes. They may still be physically present. They may still care. But the part of them that once fought for connection begins to shut down. And when that happens, love doesn't end loudly. It fades quietly, philosophically. This is the tragedy of avoidance. It doesn't just push people away. It teaches the people who stay to betray their own emotional truth. It conditions them to believe that love requires endurance, not mutual presence. And by the time they realize how much of themselves they've given up, they're already wounded. Eventually, the partner reaches a breaking point. Not an explosion, but a decision. A moment of clarity where they recognize that love should not feel like constant uncertainty. That intimacy should not require erasing oneself. And when they choose to step back, to leave, or simply to stop trying, the dynamic finally shifts. That shift is what the avoidant feels later. But for now, understand this. The heart is not destroyed in a single moment of abandonment. It's dismantled slowly through unanswered needs, inconsistent presence, and the quiet normalization of emotional loneliness inside a relationship. And here's the closing truth to sit with. The deepest heartbreak is not being left. It's staying long enough to lose yourself, hoping someone else will finally choose to stay present. At some point, the pattern breaks, not because the avoidant suddenly becomes brave, but because the strategy they've relied on stops working. This is the moment most people misunderstand. They imagine the avoidant waking up one day flooded with regret, suddenly aware of everything they lost. But the reality is quieter, more disorienting, and far more confronting than a dramatic emotional collapse. The breaking point begins with absence. The partner stops reaching out. The emotional pressure that once felt overwhelming is gone. There are no more late-night conversations, no more attempts to repair, no more requests for reassurance. On the surface, this looks like relief. The avoidant finally has space. Their nervous system settles. The environment feels calmer, and for a brief moment, they may believe they've made the right choice, but something feels off. Psychologically, human beings are not designed for disconnection, no matter how independent they appear. We regulate through relationships, we stabilize through emotional mirrors, and when someone who once oriented their emotional world around us disappears, the system notices, even if the mind insists everything is fine. This is where the avoidance defenses begin to loosen. Without the constant activation of intimacy, the nervous system no longer needs to stay armored. And when the armor drops, what was pushed down begins to surface, not as overwhelming grief at first, but as restlessness, irritability, a sense of emptiness that no amount of distraction can fill. They scroll more, work more, date casually, stay busy, yet something remains unresolved. Philosophically, this is the cost of emotional postponement. Avoidance doesn't erase feeling, it delays it. And delayed emotion has a way of arriving uninvited, often when there is no longer a relationship to return to. The avoidant may begin to replay moments, small ones at first, a look on their partner's face, a conversation they shut down, a text they never replied to. These memories don't come with clarity yet, they come with discomfort, a vague sense that something valuable slipped through their hands. But instead of leaning into that discomfort, the avoidant often reaches for explanation. We weren't compatible. It wouldn't have worked. I needed to protect myself, and for a while those explanations hold. But then comes the moment that changes everything, the realization that the partner has truly moved on. This realization doesn't always arrive through words. Sometimes it comes through social media, mutual friends, or an energetic shift that's hard to articulate. The partner no longer feels available. They're no longer waiting. They're no longer oriented toward the avoidant emotionally. And that's when the avoidant's internal narrative collapses. Because as long as the partner was still hoping, still attached, still emotionally present, the avoidant's distance felt reversible. There was comfort in knowing they could return if they wanted to. But once that door closes, once the emotional bond is no longer accessible, the avoidant is forced to confront something they've never had to face before: finality. Psychologically, finality is destabilizing for avoidants because it removes control. They can no longer manage closeness on their terms. They can no longer retreat knowing connection will remain available. The loss becomes real, not theoretical, not abstract, but embodied. This is often the first time grief fully registers. And it doesn't show up as clean sadness. It shows up as regret laced with confusion, longing mixed with defensiveness, a deep ache accompanied by the unsettling question, why didn't I feel this sooner? The answer is uncomfortable but simple. They did feel it. They just didn't allow it to reach consciousness. Avoidants are often shocked by the intensity of their delayed pain. They tell themselves they're not supposed to feel this way. They believe distance made them strong, independent, self-contained. But now, alone with the truth of their loss, they feel exposed. The coping mechanisms that once defined them, logic, autonomy, detachment, offer no relief. This is the breaking point. Not because they suddenly become emotional, but because their emotional suppression fails. Philosophically, this moment forces a reckoning. If the strategy that kept you safe also kept you from intimacy, was it really protection or was it isolation disguised as strength? If avoiding vulnerability led to the loss of someone who loved you deeply, what exactly were you protecting? Some avoidants turn away at this point. They double down. They minimize the loss, convince themselves it wasn't real love, and retreat further into self-sufficiency. This path leads to repetition. The same pattern, different faces, the same ending, but others pause, they sit with. They sit with the discomfort instead of escaping it. They begin to see the pattern, not just in this relationship, but across their life. They recognize that the common denominator isn't the partners, the timing, or the circumstances. It's the fear of emotional exposure. And for the first time, they consider the possibility that intimacy didn't destroy them, avoidance did. This realization is painful, but it's also powerful, because awareness, once it arrives, cannot be unseen. The avoidant begins to understand that the heartbreak they postponed has finally arrived, not because they were abandoned, but because they never fully showed up. They see how their silence spoke louder than words, how their withdrawal shaped the emotional climate, how love didn't end because it was unsafe, but because it was never allowed to deepen. This is where accountability begins, not in self-blame, but in truth. And here's the part most people miss. The breaking point is not the end of the story. It's the moment of choice. The moment where avoidance can either harden into a permanent identity or soften into self-awareness. Where pain can either reinforce fear or become the catalyst for growth. So let me leave you with this. The moment avoidance stops protecting you is the moment it reveals what it cost you and what it will continue to cost you unless you choose differently.